The man who stood beside my grandfather's casket wasn't a family friend. I'd never seen him before. He was tall, late 60s, wearing a dark wool coat that looked like it had been pressed that morning. He waited until the other two people, a pastor and a cemetery worker, had stepped back before he approached me. He didn't say he was sorry for my loss. He said, "Your grandfather asked me to find you when this day came. There's something in Reykjavik that belongs to your family now. You'll need to go." He pressed a card into my hand, a phone number, an address, a last name, Odinson. Then he walked away between the headstones, and I stood there in the January wind holding a card I couldn't explain, over a man I thought I'd understood completely. My grandfather, I always called him Grandpa, never his first name, never anything formal, had been a high school shop teacher for 31 years in a small town in central Ohio called Millhaven. He taught woodworking, auto mechanics, basic electrical. He drove the same Ford pickup for 22 years. He paid cash for things when he could and kept a garden that produced more tomatoes than one man could ever eat. He gave the rest away. He wasn't a veteran. He wasn't a CEO. He hadn't invented anything or held office or made the local paper for any reason except once, when he fixed the gymnasium bleachers during winter break so the basketball season wouldn't be canceled. He was the quietest person I have ever known. Not shy. Quiet. There's a difference. When he passed, a stroke in his sleep 2 days before his 81st birthday, I was the one who answered the call from the hospital. My mother had been listed as next of kin, but she died 4 years earlier, a long illness that took longer than anyone expected and left the rest of us wrung out in ways we still don't fully talk about. That made me the only one left in any real sense. My uncle, my mother's older brother, a man I'll call by the name he preferred, which was just Tanner, called me within an hour of the notification. He asked, not "How are you holding up?" Not "I can't believe he's gone." "I don't know yet," I said. "He must have had something, the house alone." I told him I'd call when I knew more. I didn't call. The funeral was small because Grandpa's world had gotten small over time. His friends from the school had mostly passed or moved. The neighbors knew him, but not well. The pastor was kind and said the right things, but he'd only met Grandpa twice, and you could feel that in the eulogy. It was respectful but general, like a suit off a rack that almost fits. I was the one who placed the single flower arrangement, yellow mums, because those were his garden colors in September. After the cemetery, I went to his house. It smelled exactly like it always had, sawdust and coffee and the faint trace of the lemon oil he used on the furniture he built himself. The kitchen table was his, the bookshelves in the hall were his, the bed frame in the back room, the lamp on the side table, the cabinet in the garage that held 40 years of organized hardware, all of it made by his hands. I sat at the kitchen table and didn't do anything for a long time. Then I opened the card. The phone number had an international country code I didn't recognize at first. I had to look it up. Iceland. I read the address 3 times. I had no idea what I was looking at. I put the card on the table and went through the house the way you do when someone is gone and you're suddenly responsible for the whole of their life in objects. His files were in a metal cabinet in the bedroom closet. Tax returns going back to 1987. Insurance documents, utility bills and folders labeled in his handwriting, which was small and precise and looked like it had been practiced. At the back of the cabinet, behind a folder labeled Miscellaneous, I found a passport. It had been renewed twice. The most recent version was 7 years old. I opened it and counted the stamps. Iceland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, trips spaced roughly 2 years apart, going back almost 15 years, none of them during holidays. None of them it's mentioned to me, or I was fairly certain to anyone. I sat on the edge of his bed and looked at those stamps for a long time. "Did you find a will?" "There's a will," I said. "I have the attorney's name, and the house goes to you?" "To the estate, technically. I'm the executor." He exhaled. "Look, I just want to make sure things are handled fairly. We're the only family left." That wordy sat in my chest like something cold. "I'll be in touch," I said, and hung up. I did not tell him about the passport. I did not tell him about the card. That night, I looked up the address in Reykjavik. It corresponded to a financial services firm. Nothing flashy, nothing that came up prominently in any search. A small firm with a clean website in both Icelandic and English. Professional, understated. I called the number the next morning, sitting at my grandfather's kitchen table with both hands wrapped around his coffee mug, because the house was cold and I hadn't figured out the thermostat yet. A man answered. Calm, slightly accented English. I said my grandfather's name. There was a pause. "Yes," he said. "We've been waiting to hear from you. I'm very sorry for your loss. When you're ready to travel, we'd like to meet in person. I asked what this was about. It would be better to explain that here, he said. I know that's not the answer you're hoping for, but it was your grandfather's preference. His preference, I repeated. He was a very deliberate man that I couldn't argue with. I booked a flight 4 days later. I didn't tell Tanner. I told him I was meeting with the estate attorney to go over probate paperwork, which was true enough to hold him for a week. The morning of my flight, he showed up at the house. No call ahead. He just pulled into the driveway like he had somewhere to be and let himself in through the side door, which he knew was unlocked because he'd grown up in this house too. He looked around the living room the way someone looks at a storage unit they're about to bid on. I was in the area, he said. He wasn't. Tanner lived 45 minutes away and worked from home. I just want to take stock, he said. Get a sense of what's here. It's a house, I said, same as it's always been. He ran his hand across the back of the couch my grandfather had reupholstered in 1998. He never updated anything. He didn't want to. Tanner sat down at the kitchen table, my grandfather's chair, without thinking about it, or maybe thinking about it exactly. He wasn't a sentimental man. He was, actually. You two always had your thing. I didn't answer that. I just don't want decisions being made without me, he said. Especially financial decisions. I'm the executor, Tanner. I know that. I'm just saying. He looked out the window at the backyard where the garden had gone brown and flat in the winter. He didn't leave much, did he? I thought about the passport in my bag. I don't know yet, I said. Reykjavik in February is dark in the mornings and gray by noon and dark again before 5. I hadn't expected to find it calming, but I did. The city was quiet in the way that my grandfather was quiet. Not empty, just deliberate. Like it didn't need to prove anything. The office was on a narrow street near the old harbor. Stone and glass, clean lines, a small brass plate by the door with the firm's name. Inside, everything moved slowly and on purpose. I gave my grandfather's name at the front desk. A woman nodded and made a call. A man appeared within a few minutes. He was maybe 55, gray at the temples, a dark suit. He introduced himself as Mr. Sigurdsson and led me down a hall that smelled like old paper and something faintly like cedar. He came here the first time in 2008, Mr. Sigurdsson said as we walked. He said a friend recommended us. He said he had some money he didn't intend to spend and wanted it to do something useful after he was gone. We sat down in a private office. He opened a folder on the desk between us. My grandfather's signature was on the first page, dated March 14, 2009. He established a trust, Mr. Sigurdsson said. A private charitable trust structured under both Icelandic and U.S. law. He contributed to it consistently over the following 14 years. I looked at the documents without touching them. What was it for? I asked. He folded his hands. Your grandfather designated the funds for a specific purpose. Educational support for children of tradespeople, specifically shop teachers, vocational instructors, people in skilled trades who faced financial hardship, college tuition, trade school certification, vocational program fees. I sat back slowly. He was a shop teacher, I said. Yes, he mentioned that. He never said anything about this. Mr. Sigurdsson nodded. He was very clear that he didn't want recognition for it. His word was, he glanced at a note in the folder, I'm not doing this for credit. I'm doing it because somebody did it for me once, and I never got the chance to thank them. My throat tightened. I asked how much was in the trust. He slid a single page across the desk. The number at the bottom was $4.3 million. I stared at it for what felt like a long time. My grandfather clipped coupons. He bought his work boots at the end of season sale. He drove that truck until the door handle needed a rubber band to stay closed. He had lived in the same house for 50 years and refished the floors himself rather than hire someone. How? Said. It came out as one word. Conservative investments long-term, Mr. Sigurdsson said. He started with a modest amount and added regularly, even in small increments. Compound interest over 14 years is significant. And he never withdrew anything for personal use. He said it the same way the documents probably said it. Simple, factual. My grandfather had been a quiet man who built things with his hands and gave away his tomatoes and never mentioned Switzerland or Iceland or 14 years of deliberate private generosity. There was also a letter. Mr. Sigurdsson placed it on the desk last. A regular envelope, sealed, my name written on the front in that small, precise handwriting I'd known my whole life. My hands were steadier than I expected when I picked it up. I didn't open it right away. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Tanner, I let it ring once before I answered. So, he said. How did the meeting with the attorney go? Still in it, I said. I'll call you tonight. Is there anything? From the estate? I looked at the letter in my hand. "There's something," I said. "I'll explain when I'm home." I opened the letter after he hung up. The paper was thick and cream-colored, not like anything he'd had in his house. He must have bought it specifically for this. The handwriting was careful, like he'd thought about each sentence before he put it down. "I don't have a good way to start this, so I'll just start. I've been putting money away since 2009 for a purpose I should have explained to you in person. I'm sorry I didn't. I kept telling myself I'd find the right time, and I kept not finding it, and now you're reading this instead. When I was 23, I wanted to go to trade school. I had the grades. I had the interest. I didn't have the money. A man I barely knew, a neighbor of my parents, someone I couldn't have picked out of a lineup at the time, paid my first semester fees. He didn't tell my parents. He didn't tell me until I was already enrolled. He said he'd had someone do the same for him once, and he was just passing it along. I spent the next 60 years trying to figure out how to repay that. The trust is not a secret fortune. It's a responsibility. You're the successor trustee. That means the decisions are yours now. I chose you because you're steady. I knew that before you knew it yourself, not because I don't love him, because he would. Build on it or maintain it. Either is fine. Just don't let it become something it wasn't meant to be. The man in the wool coat is named Whitmore. He's an old friend. He'll answer your questions if you have them. I love you. I should have said that more plainly when I had the time. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I sat in that quiet office in Reykjavik for several minutes without speaking. Then I asked Mr. Sigurdsson to walk me through the disbursements. He had records going back to the first year, anonymized summaries carefully organized. A young woman in rural Kentucky who enrolled in a nursing assistant program after her father, a plumber, lost 3 fingers in a work accident and went on disability. A boy in New Mexico whose mother taught automotive at a Votech school and died of cancer when he was 16. The trust covered his first 2 years of community college. A girl in central Ohio, not far from Millhaven, who'd wanted to go to culinary school and couldn't get a loan because her credit history was tied to her parents' debts. The trust paid her tuition outright. 41 recipients over 14 years. My grandfather had known none of their names. He'd set up the criteria and trusted the firm to identify candidates and disperse funds without his involvement in individual cases. You don't do it for the credit, he'd written. You just do it. When I stepped back outside, the harbor was gray and still, and somehow exactly right. I walked for a long time before going back to my hotel. That evening I called Tanner. "So explain it to me," he said when he answered. I did. The trust, the amount, the purpose, the structure. I went through it methodically, the same way Mr. Sigurdsson had walked me through it with me. When I finished, there was a long silence. $4 million, Tanner said. And he never touched it. Not once. Another silence, and it's all going to strangers. It's going to a specific purpose he set up legally 14 years ago. I'm his son, Tanner said. I'm the only son he had, I know, and I get nothing. I thought about the letter, about the line. Don't let Tanner dissolve it. Not because I don't love him. The will covers the house and his personal assets, I said. The trust is a separate structure. That doesn't make it fair. He made a legal decision about money he earned. Tanner's voice shifted. Not louder, but tighter. You're going to sit there and defend him keeping secrets from his own family? I'm going to honor what he built. You sound just like him. I didn't answer that. I'll talk to an attorney, he said. I figured you would. We hung up, and I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and read my grandfather's letter again. Slowly this time. I chose you because you're steady. I didn't feel steady. I felt like someone had handed me a weight I hadn't known existed until 5 days ago, and now it was mine for the rest of my life. But I also understood, for the first time, why he'd lived the way he had. Why he drove the old truck and kept the garden and gave away the tomatoes. He hadn't been withholding, he'd been directing. Every dollar he didn't spend on himself was a dollar that stayed in the trust and compounded and became $2 and eventually became something that could change a life. He'd been doing it quietly, without acknowledgement, for 14 years. I flew home 2 days later. Tanner had already been to the house. I could tell from the way a few things had been moved. Small things, like he'd been assessing. He didn't take anything, but he'd looked. He filed a formal legal challenge 6 weeks after I returned. A petition with the circuit court citing lack of disclosure of foreign assets in the estate documents and questioning my grandfather's mental capacity in the later years of the trust's operation. His attorney was sharp and prepared. Tanner had moved quickly. I hired a probate attorney in Columbus named Catherine Aldridge. No connection to the trust, just recommended by the estate attorney. She reviewed everything I had and called me the day after. "This is solid," she said. "He was thorough. Did he expect to be challenged?" He mentioned in his letter that he thought Tanner would contest it. He was right about that. A pause. He was right about a few things, sounds like. The first hearing was unremarkable. Fluorescent lights, beige walls, a judge with reading glasses reviewing documents while both attorneys summarized. Tanner sat at the other table. He didn't look at me. He looked tired in a way I recognized. It was the same look he'd had at my mother's funeral, that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from wanting something to be different than it is. His attorney argued that the trust had been established without disclosure to family members, and that, given my grandfather's age at the time of the final contributions, there were questions of undue influence. Catherine responded evenly. The trust predated any arguable period of cognitive decline by over a decade, had been maintained with documentation and consistency, and had been referenced, though not itemized, in the estate will. The judge requested additional documentation. We provided it. At the second hearing, Mr. Whitmore appeared. He'd flown in from out of state and he didn't tell me he was coming. He was already seated in the gallery when I arrived, still wearing a dark wool coat. He looked as composed as he had at the cemetery. Catherine called him as a witness. He testified simply. He had known my grandfather for 30 years, he said. They'd met at a woodworking seminar, of all things. He knew about the trust from the beginning. My grandfather had told him when he set it up, because he'd needed someone to know, someone who wasn't going to make it into a conversation. Tanner's attorney asked whether Mr. Whitmore had encouraged or influenced my grandfather's decision to create the trust. Mr. Whitmore paused one beat before answering. He didn't take encouragement about things he'd already decided, he said. If anything, he talked me into giving more of my own money to things I'd been putting off. There was a quiet shift in the room after that. The judge's ruling came at the third hearing. The trust was valid. The timeline was unambiguous. There was no evidence of undue influence, no legal basis for dissolution. The petition was dismissed. Outside the courthouse, Tanner and I stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a moment. He didn't have anything ready to say. I could see him working on something the way you do when the outcome isn't what you planned for. "You really weren't going to give on this," he said finally. "No. Even knowing what it would cost us. He didn't build it to be dissolved." Tanner looked down the street. "I needed that money," he said quietly. "Not to me, really. Just out loud. I know." He shook his head. "When the business went under the first time, and before that, when I had the tax situation. He never said a word about it, never held it over me. Just gave it and moved on. That sounds like him. I thought that meant he understood. That family comes first. Maybe it meant he already gave you what he could without touching what he was building." Tanner looked at me for the first time since the ruling. "There's a secondary clause," I said, "in the trust. If I choose, I can allocate a portion annually for direct family support. Structured, conditional, with oversight." He was quiet. "It would mean working with a financial counselor," I said. "A plan, not a lump sum. Debt addressed in stages, you'd manage that? The trust would... I'd oversee it." He didn't respond right away. He looked back down the street. "He put that in there," Tanner said. It wasn't quite a question. He thought of most things. A long pause. "I don't want to be the one who sued his own niece over money," he said finally. I didn't point out that he'd already done it. "Then be the one who did and moved on," I said. He almost smiled. Almost. We didn't hug. We didn't make plans. But when he got in his car, he raised a hand once through the window, and I raised mine back. That was enough for that day. The first night I got home, I went to the safe deposit box the estate attorney had flagged in the inventory, a small box at a bank in Millhaven, paid up through the year. Inside were 3 things. A photograph of my grandfather at maybe 35, standing next to a man I didn't recognize in front of what looked like a trade school building, both of them squinting into the sun. A folded piece of paper with a list of names, 41 of them, I counted. No other context, just names. And a short note in his handwriting, separate from the letter. The man in the photo is Gerald Kuhn. He paid my first semester at Lakewood Tech in 1965. He died in 1987. I never had the chance to tell him what that did for my life. Don't make the same mistake with the people you're grateful for. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot and held that note for a while. The trust is still operating. Disbursements go out quarterly. 2 students started programs last fall, one in HVAC certification in Tennessee, one in dental assisting in rural Wisconsin. Tanner completed his first 6 months with the financial counselor and has started paying down the oldest of his debts systematically, without drama. He sends me updates occasionally. Brief ones. He doesn't thank me, and I don't need him to. A year after the ruling, I drove back to Millhaven and stood in my grandfather's backyard where the garden had come back green in the spring. The tomato plants he'd put in last summer were still there, grown wild without anyone to tend them properly. I thought about Gerald Kuhn, who paid a young man's semester tuition in 1965 and probably never knew what followed from it. All the things that followed from it. The 31 years of students who learned to work with their hands. The careful money set aside, year after year, in the quiet dark of an account in Iceland. The 41 people who got something they couldn't have gotten otherwise from a man they would never meet, who left no plaques and gave no speeches and asked for nothing at all in return. My grandfather wasn't a complicated person. He was a precise one. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it steadily, and he trusted that someone would carry it forward when he was gone. I don't always feel equal to that. Some mornings I look at the trust documents and feel the weight of it more than the purpose. But then I think about the photograph. 2 men squinting into the sun, one of them young and not yet knowing what his life would become, and I remember that most of the important things don't announce themselves. They just show up, and you decide what to do with them.